shall we receive a link to all live streamings on YouTube or?
Already done.
Okay.
So I can put the live stream here, which is some kind of backup.
Mm-hmm.
And also for me, it's a test. So maybe some session in the future, we can do this and live stream.
Okay.
But personally, I'm not ready yet.
Mm-hmm.
To see my face afterwards on Facebook or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Good day, everyone. Bom dia, buenos dias.
Buenos días. Bom dia. Guten Tag. Hey da.
Servus, grüezi. Salut.
Watcha.
Where are you from, Ian?
So that's Swiss. So in Zurich, you say salut, which sounds very cool. And then you have a different level of moin. If you're on Berlin, is moin moin. If you're on Hamburg, is moin. If you're in Luxembourg, is moyen. If you're in South Germany, it is Moje. And you should respond, I don't care, you're right. Yeah, Alf, it's my summer haircut. It's briefing.
Well, everyone, it is just 11 o'clock, and Jan, I'm going to just allow a few more minutes for people to arrive. I know there are going to be a lot of participation here. For people who are already here, I would invite you to just say hello in the chat and remind us where you're from, and we will start here in just a moment. Yeah, we're getting a lot of people joining here.
Glenn, greetings. How you doing? Long time no see. Alfie here, Alf Rock. Can you see me?
Hello.
How you doing?
Fine, thank you. I integrated one of your visuals in my presentation.
What's that?
I integrated one of your visuals from your presentation in mine.
Yep, thanks.
I'm not sure, is that a good thing?
Well, I'm not sure either.
Sorry, what did you say? You're not sure what?
Whether that's a good thing or not.
Pierre, we noticed a new haircut. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Almost like it this morning. I want to have Zach's haircut, but I didn't reach this level.
Okay.
He is too mature for me.
Be persistent. You shall get there.
But I love to piss off all my colleagues from my age. You say, you have too much hair. Yes.
Rub it in.
Yeah. No, it's a nightmare when it's becoming warm. We have 30 degrees centigrade in Germany. So it's way too
calculator.
warm. I don't know. You have some weird Fahrenheit, something like this, right?
Oh yeah, you have the weird centigrade.
No, we're right. We are right.
We're always right.
There we have
81 degrees.
There we have 43 degrees centigrade in India.
Yeah, that's so pain.
All right, everybody.
43. Wow. Okay.
Okay, hi, Joanna.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Hi, Stephen.
Hey.
And a warm welcome to Heidi. Are you in Portugal? I have to give you some contact in Portugal. I know very, very nice people there. And a lot of crazy women. Very inspiring.
Well, welcome everyone for our latest deep dive with Jan De Visch. Jan, you're all set and ready to go. We still have people joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. This is a follow-up to his session on the future, and well, I'm going to leave it to you, Jan. Let's just take over.
Okay. Well, I prepared a short presentation. So I prepared good morning or good afternoon, everyone, for today's session. I prepared a brief introduction, like previous time. I will share my screen, but I have experienced that when I share my screen, I have not always a view on the questions in the chat. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. And if I may ask Pierre or Scott or Jordi, if you notice some interesting questions, and if I might have overlooked them, please interrupt me so that we can build a dialogue today.
Absolutely.
Is someone going to be harvesting the questions so that we can get a look at them later?
Yes. Yes.
So I would like to take a deeper dive together with all of you today. And when preparing this session, I had an invitation last week to attend a management meeting. And after that management meeting, I said, gosh, that's the example that I need to begin with. And the name that I gave to the case is a fictitious name. So I called it the Ravid case, but it actually happened last week. It was me attending a management team meeting, and this was the dialogue started from the CEO. The CEO started the meeting saying, hey guys, we have a problem. We are faced with a sharp drop in sales. Our revenues have decreased by 45%, while we have only been able to reduce our costs by 9%. And within 2 months, we'll have a liquidity problem. In the meantime, we are experiencing many problems in our logistics chain. Air cargo rates have risen by 89%. And at the same time, our distributors in various countries are struggling with severe lockdowns, as a result of which customers are postponing their sales and their orders. I mean, due to travel restrictions, our account managers are also unable to visit customers on site and provide support. And our account managers are advocating accelerating the more ecosystemic approach they had already advocating before the COVID crisis. And part of our employees have switched to working from home, and I wonder whether the initial productivity increase will continue. Our offices and production areas are not suited to respecting the distance rules, and I noticed that good employee initiatives are not coordinated. And in the meantime, we have been confronted with new regulations. To receive financial support from the government, we have to draw up a sustainability plan. We must significantly reduce our ecological footprint. And the first objective is to reduce our ecological footprint by 30%. And at the moment, I don't see how we can make the investments for this. Our loan burden at financial institutions is already too high. This is one of the 4 examples I have been confronted with over the last 2 weeks. And I thought, gosh, that's a good point of departure to discuss the new reality companies are in, and to illustrate how the approach that I was introducing last week may make a difference. The first thing that I noticed was, well, you know, some people listen from this perspective and they hear drop in sales, problems in our logistics chain, productivity increase, new regulations. While I quickly noticed that other participants around the table had a quite different hearing of the situation their CEO was explaining. And basically, we are all creating stories all the time in the companies we work into. And even when we talk about requisite agility, we are creating the storyline. And one of the issues I would like to share with you is, well, on what basis will we select and combine methodologies to create what kind of stories? And will those stories make a difference? Will they enable the learning process within teams and collectively? That's basically the question I would like to dive into tonight or today. So if we agree that we build and share stories, we have, I've used the cartoon of the Wizard of Fog last time to illustrate that king is telling or constructing his own story. And the construction of stories that I call the external workplace. It's the place we're all familiar with. But some of us are busy with their internal workplace. They are engaging in a kind of a self-awareness program, and most of those programs are focused on competencies and skills and personality style. What is often missed in self-development is becoming conscious of the scripts we are subject to. By scripts, that what I mean there is the ego that plays a role. And by cognitive maps, I mean, what is it that we take into account as concepts in creating the reality? For example, we create a completely different reality when we focus on the relationships between the liquidity problem, customers postponing their orders, and the drawing up of a sustainability plan versus building upon concepts such as drop in sales, problems in the logistics chain, productivity increase. You can compare it with the four blinds trying to make sense of the animal before them and to try to find out whether that's an elephant or not. We see different aspects of the animal, and that's the external workplace that we are confronted or that we construct daily. Basically, that's our experience of reality, and that's filled of emotion and convictions of the truth. I think over the last sessions that we have been confronted with a lot of models that take a perspective on the truth. And some of us find their models very truth. Others can take a meta perspective and look behind the models. If we use some concepts, like, for example, layers in an organization, the thinking structure that we use is that we believe that reality is stratified and that we need to find out what kind of stratification makes sense in this particular context. So that's part of a map we use or we do not use. And based on the maps we use, we also go looking and searching for data. And our movements in thought determine what we see, what kind of storylines that we create or not create. And in order to make a summary of what we saw last time, for those who were not able to participate, I made a distinction between 4 broad categories of discovery procedures, which I call discovery procedures to make sense of the broader context. Let's say the question, what's the bigger picture that is relevant here? We use maps to make sense of emergence and evolution. These are notions that we have on the future, the past, the present, and how they influence each other. We have notions on relationship, what we need to bring into relationship or not. And we have notions about disequilibria and tension. So the essence is that we can focus on the thought structures, and the essence of what I was sharing last time was that our thought structures determine the kind of content that we produce. In order to apply it to the example, we could ask, this is the story, the introduction of the CEO, what kind of discovery procedures are used in this text fragment? Does this CEO use contextual thought forms, process thought forms, relationship thought forms, or transformational thought forms? I can let you think for a minute. Does anyone has an answer to that question, or could anyone try to start answering this question? Which discovery procedure, are there any thought structures used in this text fragment?
Can we speak?
Yes, you can.
So there's a lot of context and maybe, elements relating to each other. So maybe a bit of relationship, but most of it is context and a little, maybe 1 or 2 process.
Well,
pointers.
Thank you very much for that answer, because I deliberately chose this fragment to illustrate that there is no context at all. It is a pure summing up of concepts. And when we talk about context, we talk about what is the relationship between the part and the larger whole. For example, what is specific the relationship between, for example, the liquidity problem and the revenues that decrease, or the costs that cannot be reduced. There is no sense at all of how the part is here related to the whole. Also, when the person talks about the logistics chain, it's purely a summing up of concepts, abstractions. And we have no clue what the relationship is between the specific concept of a logistics chain and, for example, the air cargo rates. The only thing that you can say is that the logistics chain here is reduced to the concept of air cargo, but you have no clue what part concepts, how those concepts make sense in the larger whole or function as, let's say, the larger whole for other concepts. which means that if we want to solve one or more problems in this situation, well, most of us fall back to models and concepts. And I will come back to that in just a minute, because we can ask ourselves the question, what kind of combination of models could help here to make sense of this context and even to build a kind of a quality dialogue that enables qualitative decision-making of the management team. Because if we talk about requisite agility, we talk about the agility necessary to cope, to help that organization cope with the environment. But do we have a view on the environment here? No, no context specified. Do we have a view on the emerging changes in that environment? No, no emerging changes specified. Even there is not a beginning of a relationship model in this, and even there is not a sense of where is the potential in the tension that we are experiencing. So we are dealing here with a very low developed manager, which just applies in a kind of a stupid way business models from business schools, if I may. And I think in this audience, I may be a bit more explicit than in other audiences. If we talk about... Yes? Yes, can you repeat your question? I thought I heard something, but
This was just background noise, sorry.
Okay. No problem. So if we just to go a bit deeper into the understanding of what it is, if we talk about context, process, relationship, or transformation, that means that in contextual thinking, we make explicit how the issue is part of the broader context. For example, if we point to problems in our logistic chain, what is here the bigger context of that logistic chain? And that can be revising the sustainability approach of the company, which brings quite a different perspective compared with, for example, a kind of a specific client-centric approach. Both make sense, but with both you will have a different relationship part whole. You can also go deeper into what's the layering, what's the stratification within that logistic chain in, for example, the competitive landscape, which enables you to make much more sense of that context. So if we talk about context thinking, we go beyond logical thinking. We start to create the storyline and the reality, and it will focus our attention on what is happening in that context. The same for process thought forms. What are unseen dimensions here in what we do not yet see in, for example, the COVID crisis? And how do we go beyond what the popular literature and the press and the social media publish around, let's say, scenarios and evolutions in that respect? Most companies, at least those that I visited over the last 2-3 weeks, they start from an assumption that we must prepare for a second lockdown. But what does that mean, a second lockdown? If you do not probe yourself in a kind of a reinterpretation of the past and the future, you cannot act in the present. And that's particularly what process thinking is all about. Relationship thinking is then about what is the specific structural nature of the relationships that we see. What is, for example, the relationship between logistic issues and the ecosystemic approach that our commercial people were advocating? And perhaps I can build upon the ecosystemic approach of the commercial people to redesign the logistics chain. I have one client who needed to reinvent their logistic chain in about 1 week. And now they came to the conclusion, I had just a call before this meeting with them, that those new solutions will enable them to multiply, to accelerate their growth trajectory by a multiple of 4. So they expect their turnover to multiply by 4 by completely reshuffling the logistics chain, departing from a completely new set of relationships that they saw, which you will probably find published in the Harvard Business Review in 5 to 10 years. But then, well, Harvard Business Review only publishes, let's say, past stories which might inspire those who weren't in touch with the evolutions in reality and did not practice process and relationship thought forms. The same for transformation. It is about what are the tensions and the disequilibria, and more specifically in defining the potential, and in defining that potential, enabling the comparison, the comparative evaluation of different systemic approaches, and decide upon which one is better than the other. What we are often doing as consultants, and that's basically the reason why requisite agility has been, let's say, shaped by Amit. He saw that there is a potential in transcending frameworks. Not saying that frameworks are not valuable, because in each framework, I advocated that last time, there are some implicit thought forms that were often practiced by those who created the frameworks, but not always seen by those who are reutilizing the frameworks. And we often use frameworks. For example, we can have a perspective on stratification and say, well, you know, 7 layers, that's the ideal layering, or 5 is the ideal depending on the strategy. But then we are, let's say, confusing the model that we have on reality with the reality. And we use a lot of artifacts. For example, business model canvases. That's a very bright summary of categories, but it gives no clue about the contextual thinking. We need to add contextual thinking to work with such a model in a meaningful way. The business model canvas doesn't give you a clue about the relationships between, for example, customer segments and customer relationships. The content and the use will depend on the fluidity of the thinking of the group of users of this framework. The same with, for example, another approach which makes the distinction between the building blocks that I just projected on the screen: customer decision journey, organization, data analytics, strategy and innovation, process automation, and technology. Or still another framework. I can select at least 200 frameworks which offer you categories to look at a storyline like the one the CEO was just using. And well, they offer contextual possible building blocks of the context, but if you do not see that the value of these frameworks is not in the categories that they offer, but in your personal thinking that you unfold while applying these frameworks, then you have made a first step to grow as a requisite agility practitioner. Because as a requisite agility practitioner, you will immediately see that these are all frameworks helpful to start unfolding the context, but that's the very first humble step. And if you confound these templates, diagrams, or frameworks with reality, you might end up in a storyline that is completely detached with reality. But if you know that these are contextual thought forms, that there is a potential to enrich the context, then you know that in a requisite agility approach, you need to combine it with other frameworks that probe for process. For example, scenario thinking, or maturity models, or the Seki model, which offer, let's say, a first step into process. All these models help you to point to process, but they are completely unfitted to think through patterns in processes, to think through implicit processes versus explicit processes. They are not able to help you to think through stratification in dynamics and so on. You only know that if I combine a model that uses the time dimension with a model that, let's say, draws the attention to contextual categories, that you, at least if you combine the two, you will have a richer thinking process that forms the basis for better and more holistic decision making. So as a requisite agility practitioner, you will basically consider all types of diagrams, templates, visuals, models as from the point of view of what is the implicit thought structures that they favor, and if I can combine them with other models, how will I build a richer picture on the perspective? So we need to pay attention not to confuse the maps we use, the templates we use, with the reality we engage in. And in that reality, we have already distinguished, let's say, 4 broad categories. We can go a bit deeper. And if you look at recent cognitive developmental research, they came up with the identification of a kind of a meta maps. Those meta maps enable you to see through the models and the templates that you use. And they help you to, let's say, go in an elaboration process. If you point to categories, the first step is to recognize those categories and to recognize how they function in a part-whole relationship. The second step within context is to elaborate that and to think through that each of the categories that I'm using has a certain structure and has a certain stability. And then you can form a more integrated perspective. That means that you can start thinking from multiple contexts and multiple frames of reference. And you have those 3 thought structure steps in each of the thought form classes, or another word is the broad search categories that enable you to make sense of reality. And for those who start learning that, and the persons who read my work, they will be offered a lot of questions that are behind those thought structures that enable you to go a bit deeper than the whatever model that you choose. For example, if you choose to use the discovery procedure, elaboration of the structure of the whole and defining the structure and stability of the system, well, you will have access to questions such as what makes these functions, these elements or categories function together so harmoniously. So if we, for example, find it important to look to categories such as culture, structure, and processes, it helps you to think through in that particular context what makes the combination of function of those categories function harmoniously in this specific context. And that will give you insight in also the limits of best practice, things that work in one context, but that will probably not work in another context. And it will also help you to discover, let's say, new solutions and new leverage points to intervene in a particular context. I would like to stop here just to probe if there are any questions at this particular moment.
Jan, just to break the ice for this session, I was just following through all your models now, but I just want to reflect when we start working as an employee in an organization. Organization practically employ people to deliver in a short term, and they expect us to deliver fast and quickly, and whatever that you do, that let's say your transformation work or restructuring of work, we may not have sufficient time to do your contextual, the contextual element in full. Maybe we able to recognize, but we may not, or we may able to elaborate, but we may not able to integrate to that level. So how do we successfully apply this throughout our day-to-day works to ensure that we deliver with agile?
The only thing that I can say is that you need to take time to think through and to reflect. There is a kind of a false promise attached to delivering fast and quickly. And certainly people coming from the Orient, China, Japan especially, they know that if you go too quickly, if you do not respect the process dynamics, if you neglect essential relationships, if you neglect transformational issues and tension, that you will end up with a lot of rework and sub-performance. I see that companies, top teams that are more fluid in their thinking, by which I mean they practice, if they address issues, their fluidity of thinking is a dance over those 12 or 28 thought forms. If they do that, their performance is, and their bottom line results, both in terms of current value creation and future value creation, is 2 to 5 times the result that companies deliver when they do not engage in the thinking process. So we are currently in a kind of a neo-Tayloristic situation where efficiency and productivity is king. And we forget that we are devaluing the essence of being human, which is sense and meaning making. And if we neglect the sense and meaning making in a situation where lots of changes come together, the fourth industrial combination of the impact of, for example, robotics, artificial intelligence, blockchain, chatbot, all kinds of different technologies that come together. If we neglect to engage in a deeper thought process, well, we will end up with the losers.
Guna, in particular, one of the things that I always remember is that when I take in the problem and I look at what can I do with this problem, I have sitting there, I have the client, I have the client's organization. So if I can bring them along with me in the story and I can say, okay, I can do it this fast, but I'm not going to get the entire capability of what's going on here. Or if we take another X percent, if we take, another 25%, I'm going to be able to give you pieces that you will be able to use, not just in this engagement, but for all of the things that come beyond it. And it will allow you to strategically look out into your future markets, your future options. And so you bring the client along with you. I think that is really a piece of what Jan is pointing to.
Well, we all differ in terms of our own fluidity of thinking. And Zach, if your own fluidity of thinking is broad and deep, you can be very successful in a rather unconscious way. And you can have integrated lots of experiences and lots of models in your practice. The point I want to make is that even you can bring that to the surface and accelerate your own or increase your own impact.
Jan, I have a quick question. I think it was on the previous slide, you alluded to some cards. Could you just go back one slide? That, yeah, that one. So am I reading that correctly? You seem to have some cards that can be an augmentation to stimulate the level of thinking and the line of inquiry, almost as a gamification approach.
That's correct.
Am I reading that right?
That's right. And this is just taken from the instruction page that goes with the game. So these are the structures of thinking that are translated in the game.
So so is the game outlined in the book, or is there a way, or would we go to connecttransform.be to actually?
Yes, you can buy the game there.
Okay, good. And what's the game called?
The Rethinking Game.
Okay, so essentially, from start to finish, the game, what you're doing is you're gamifying, creating a same space where the specific methodology can be followed both individually or collectively?
That's correct, yes.
How long do you think the game would be? 2 hours, 5 hours, 20 minutes? I mean, how does the game?
Well, it's between, you have good results between 1 hour and 1 hour and a half, and even better if you can take 2 hours.
Right. So essentially, the game could be applied to both a professional or even a non-professional, as long as you had some sort of problem statement, or as long as you wanted to use
The
it.
game is currently used by a number of companies in conducting retros or reflect back workshops or intervision sessions, tackling an issue in the program management, project management, or portfolio management sphere. And the issue is, let's say, a wicked issue. You cannot solve it just by using logic.
Right.
And so the problem owner proposes the problem. Participants have a selection of cards. They select the card with a question that they find most meaningful to that situation at that particular moment.
Right.
And the problem owner keeps on choosing, well, you know, from those 4 or 5 questions put in the middle, that's the one that I find most meaningful. But at the meantime, the other questions have also indirectly been put on the table, and you get a completely different reflection process. So and then he decides to think through that question during a 5 to 10 minutes period before selecting a different question that builds upon what has been brainstormed.
That's really interesting.
You come to a kind of a holistic, integrated solution.
Right. So is this digitized, or it's just cards in a box that you play with and play the game like that? It's cards.
It's really cards, yes.
Okay. So the thing I find fascinating about this is that if you have the right players at the table, even people who might not be, you know, classified as cognitively advanced in terms of their cognitive processes, those people, if they play, if the cards are played right or the game's played right, what happens is they provide the insight of critical observations. And I forget, Clement was saying that, you know, level 4 is the last time somebody actually sees their people. What you're doing now is you're reunifying access to tacit information and tacit observations by people when they play this game, that they can say, oh yeah, we noticed that there's grease on the ground, and you know, and there's a leak, you know, whatever data point there is, the game is going to percolate some really interesting information to be accessed by people that would normally not have that information and be able to look at it in the context, process, relationship, and transformation.
I couldn't explain it better, yes.
So how many people, I mean, when you create the players in the game, I would imagine you would have to make a good mix of people along the life cycle and people with along the stratification. So you would, you know, you'd have people from the top of the organization and the bottom.
The game has been played by quite different groups at this moment. For example, I used it in a call center. In a call center, you have usually people with not so extensive educational backgrounds. And then I make sure that I only work with the contextual cards, the recognition cards in context and process, and the elaboration cards. But I leave out the other cards. While in a management team, for example, I play with the full set.
Right.
So you know that there is a developmental diversity in a team, and that you need to enter in the zone of proximal development in that team.
That is fascinating. Have you transitioned or tried it in a Zoom context or a Zoom environment?
No, because I have no internet variant. I have created a semantic intelligence software
Maybe Scott can convene some a research or some test subjects to donate their problems to one of your gamification setup. I would be fascinated to see how this might play out in terms of, say, an organizational challenge that could be, you know, even an RA organizational challenge. You know, there's always challenges everywhere, and I'm just curious how that would play out in a Zoom environment, because essentially it's an issue-based, excuse me, it's an issue-based approach. You simply are presented, Jan, with the actual issue or the challenge statement or the problem statement, and then you convene a set of players around the table and they would play the game, correct?
Yes, and while playing the game as a facilitator, you work on two levels. I talked last time about, I touched upon double listening. Well, the game allows you to tackle the subject and at the same time become conscious of the thought structures that you use and that create the content.
Yeah.
And in doing so, the game enables you to very quickly transcend possible tensions in teams and tensions between different stakeholders.
That's brilliant.
That accelerates the change process.
No, listen, I'm sold on the taste of the ice cream. I just want to taste it now.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, Scott, I don't know if you want to consider that, but this is such an intriguingly fascinating opportunity that I don't really care what issue-based approach you throw at it, but I think it's well worth exploring to see how Jan might guide us through an issue-based situation. I don't know how you feel about that, Scott.
You're referring to Scott Embler? Which Scott are you referring to, Alf?
You, sir.
Me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I'll make a point that your feedback is being well taken, and we will be planning for follow-up sessions based on the feedback that will make best sense. So we will definitely see how we can facilitate some additional exploration here.
Super.
So the essence here is that you have two patterns in movement of thought. You can follow a breadth first strategy. That means that in facilitating a dialogue, you kind of perform a dance over the different thought forms. That once you grasp the thought forms, you can build in a huge fluidity of thinking, which is moving from context to process, from process to transformation, from transformation to relationship, back to context, and so on. This is the breadth first search strategy. This is what is pretty familiar with most of us to do. But you also have the depth first strategy, and that means that if you use concepts that you go into the depth. For example, a logistic chain, if you look at it from process thought forms, it starts with recognizing how logistics change in the competitive environments are naturally evolving, and what patterns are there in those developments is then moving to elaborating. And if you start to combine different patterns, then it goes to integrating. And by integrating, you come very close to building completely new operational and business models. And you need both. Once you have practiced fluidity of thinking, you will be able to combine the breadth first and the depth first search strategy. And if you go a bit further, then you can even start to elaborate your own fluidity of thinking by making sub-distinctions within each of these. And each of these thought structures contains a whole series of questions. So it enables you to build a much richer picture of reality. I won't go into the details. I just want to point to this possibility. I have a management team who started practicing their fluidity of thinking in the middle of last year. And during the COVID crisis, they saw a number of takeover possibilities. They approached those companies from a fluidity perspective where everybody would say, gosh, this is a collaboration we want. And they managed to take over a company in less than 5 weeks. And it's their fluidity of thinking that will enable them to integrate that new company within their operations without losing the basic tenets of their culture, but immediately looking at what kind of overarching culture can we build. But in order to do so, they have explored the concept of culture from each of those thought structures. And that by doing that, in that takeover process, in the due diligence process, they were able to build a huge amount of trust within the party that they want to take over. And by the way, that party that they wanted to take over was not at all affected business-wise by the COVID crisis themselves. So it was not a question of they had no other choice. They had also plenty of choices. What you do is that, well, basically, you know, if you go deeper, that you have, let's say, V spaces. I define V spaces as typical patterns in storylines that you see in companies and that go along with a particular vocabulary. For example, if you use the SAFE framework, that uses a particular vocabulary that is basically a vocabulary that goes back to the continuous improvement V space, but that is meant to redesign value streams. And so you get a tension between the concepts used in the model, the purpose for which it is fit, and the tension with those who use it. If the users have a kind of a developmental spread, like here, team 1, that SAFE framework will be used in a downwardly directed way. They will narrow the use of the framework, while the same framework used by team 2, they will broaden it from their fluidity of thinking. We know from research that continuous improvement has a lot of challenge to embrace contextual thought forms, and even does not come to real context, process, relationship, or transformational thinking. While if you act in the business modeling space without transformational thinking, well, you might have a problem. You might not see it. You might be very enthusiastic about a kind of a static strategic plan without being aware that it lacks essential relationships and essential transformational concepts thought through. And so what you do as a facilitator is kind of in using the framework, and that's basically the core of acting as a requisite agile facilitator. He does not act as a conventional facilitator that's focused on behavioral interventions. He acts as a critical facilitator, which means a person who increases the thought complexity and questions critically, transcends the perspectives present, and keeps differences and challenges as long as possible on the table. So that's a person who speeds up while slowing down the thinking and making it richer. That's typically what is done in Japan. They spend a lot of attention to the quality of the thinking before they make a decision. And here in the West, we only use, let's say, the outcomes of their models, neglecting a bit the very, very rich thinking that is behind it. But both have their limitations. As a critical facilitator, the outcome is limited by the social emotional maturity, which is how the egos of the people play a role. And you can even start to use the thought structure process in developing quite on an individual level a quite different kind of coaching, which I call cognitive coaching. 95% of the coaching that we know is content related or behavioral related or process related in terms of thinking through the house. Critical facilitators focus on the quality of the thought structures that drive the quality of process thinking or that drive the quality of the content thinking. So both have their advantages and their disadvantages. And for those who want to, of course, a critical facilitator also acts in the conventional facilitator role. You cannot only stay in the critical facilitator role. But you can find, lots of the basic findings applied to self-organization, let's say the networked structures in organizations in my recent publications. And one of the tools is the rethinking game. So I took a bit longer. I thought my introduction would take half an hour, but I suddenly see that I spoke almost an hour. I would now like just to open the dialogue and the discussion here.
I might, Jan, there was a couple questions in the chat we might want to touch on. So let me just kind of circle back through some of these. First, you gave a wonderful example, this CEO sharing the state of the union, if you will, with the company. Can you share a little bit on the case study in terms of how, what was your intervention? I mean, what was the outcome following that open conversation?
In the company starting to practice thought forms, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that company is a scale-up. They have a business plan aiming to double their revenue every 9 months. And what they saw was that there was a gap between their strategy and how the company performed. So the growth slowed down. And they initially thought it had to do with the R&D manager who was not able to manage the programs in the company and thus the interrelationships between projects. And there the first mistake, in my opinion, was made, saying that R&D is the accountability of the R&D director. I quickly brought a discussion on, well, how are you thinking through together the limits that you see in the R&D, the R&D programs bumping in? And they say, gosh, what a strange question, but indeed we see issues and limitations. And then I said, well, how do you discuss them together? And they started to share that, and I could quickly notice, well, the very rational, logical engineering way of approaching reality. And I said, gosh, have you thought about this question and this question and this question? And they said, no, we never discussed those questions. And I said, well, all those questions are the driver of the natural evolutions in business model. How are you reinterpreting your future? And how is the reinterpretation of your future giving you a new view of reinterpreting the past in order to take a different route in your current R&D department? And we said, gosh, yes, this sounds, we have never done that. We must practice such a thing. And we started with tackling issues on the top management level with the rethinking game. And through doing that, they started to get interested in the thought structures themselves. And they asked the questions, well, how can we now recognize that some of our key people are using those thought structures or not? And how can we start to develop them on a broad scale within our company? They bought a whole series of games and they started to weave it into their what they call their reflect back workshops, which are 6 weekly meetings where critical issues in the progress or non-progress of programs, and specifically how they can manage and align different projects one on each other. For example, that has to deal with questions such as which project do we need to accelerate, which project do we need to slow down in order to be able to reuse part of what has been developed in one project to another. That's a program management decision. And I taught them to start acting as critical facilitators in those meetings, thus taking my role, because my objective is to help the client work without consultancy as fast as possible. They need to do it themselves. And they, from the whole management team, being 6 persons, one of them found that exercise quite too difficult. But it became very clear to each of the colleagues that he was not fit for that role. And then the question was raised, well, he asked himself, well, he felt, am I on the right position or not? I do not feel comfortable. Can I spend more attention more in this area? And so the discussion went very fluidly. How can we move that person out of the role to another role? And then the discussion was, well, what other person should we choose now? And we did that on the basis of assessing the thought form fluidity and the maturity level. I haven't talked about the second issue, but those are the 2, let's say, cognitive dimensions which shape our world. The maturity issue is what functions as a script, and scripts are much more difficult to change. And so they started to weave in that meta thinking perspective and to use the meta maps. And now they use it even to select groups of consultants for specific projects, because they are a project organization and they have about a small 20% of the people working in that company essentially works on specific projects or specific programs for the time of that program. And so they have a very fluid, open organization working with a lot of external people. And now they select their external people, building or making an assessment of not only what kind of expertise will that consultant bring in, but how will that person enrich the thought process in our organization. And over the last 3 months of the COVID crisis, well, I phoned my CEO clients, and that particular CEO said, Jan, you have no idea how well we are doing. And we are very lucky to have a kind of a middle management coordinating group who is now acting as a critical facilitator, because connecting really ideas and co-creating ideas in a virtual environment is much more difficult than sharing information and coming to work agreements. If we hadn't done the thought process deep dive together with you, we would never have been able to use in the Zoom meetings different methodologies like Mentimeter, like the Miro maps and so on, and they all combine it in their virtual settings. Well, basically they developed reflective practice. They do not practice. They have no idea. They have completely taken distance from the idea that you need to execute a strategy. You had to define a strategy and then execute it. No, strategy is what occurs in the collective intelligence that we are building day in, day out, in which different time horizons come together in different types of meetings at different levels. And that's working very well. I implemented such processes in financial institutions, in software houses, in even package delivery institutions, in healthcare. And it seems to work. I did it with nurses, home care nurses. And well, the moment that they started discovering that until now, they, let's say, did not think together, but were using all kinds of concepts, assuming that the colleague understood what they said, with lots of miscommunication and lots of frustration. The moment you see that everyone has a part in the co-creational process, which you can make more enriching, and they, after a relatively short time, discovered that they are able to come to quite more qualitative decision making together, and that what they decide really gets executed. There is no resistance to change anymore, because they went beyond the categories that they used on beforehand. Because resistance to change has nothing to do with resistance to change. It has to do with an absence of reflective thought, and let's say the absence of double listening. I listen to what you are saying while at the same time I'm listening to myself creating content for you. And that's the essence for me in really requisite agility. That is getting a grip on how you day in, day out construct reality using the models you have, finding ways to combine and transcend those models, adding something to the models. And the side piece that I always get is that when I enter in a situation, in a sector that I do not know, I was invited last Tuesday for a quick lunch with the CEO that I haven't met at 12:15. And I had no clue of the sector. I visited the website, but to be honest, I'm at this moment a bit overwhelmed by work. So I have not prepared that session. So I went for the quick lunch. Well, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we still sat around the table and he said, Jan, I've never met somebody who has such an in-depth knowledge of the sector as a consultant as you have. How much work have you done in our sector already? And I said, Nico, to be honest, I do not know your sector. I just listened to the thought structures you were applying, and I chose those that were absent in the discussion. And the only one who knows the sector, that is you, but you revealed it by answering the questions you haven't thought about yet. But he projected the expertise on me while I was just a critical facilitator. And at 4 o'clock, we signed the contract to start the project in September to redesign the top structure of his organization.
Awesome. Jan, we have Junaid raising his hand for
Yes.
question.
You can ask the question. I do not see it, but...
Yes, so it was a in tool. I didn't physically put my hand on. So, sir, I have a question for you. In critical facilitator, you mentioned the limitation is social emotional and social emotional maturity, level of social emotional maturity.
Yes.
So is it for trainer or for the participant? You mentioned it's for participants.
It's a social emotional level of the participants, but be aware, you need to observe your own maturity yourself too. So double listening is not only listening to the thought structures that you use, but also to the scripts that you bring to the table and that others bring to the table.
How about the, yes, please.
Yes, do.
So, yeah, I have one thing. I don't know if it's directly related. How about the psychological safety of the participants? Because if you're doing it with executives, it may be the case they don't own the company, or they are the executives who are going to be the critical facilitators onward. So they have to think about themselves and move away from the positions to.
But you know, commenting on the sub-comment you made on personality profile and personality, how we describe our personality is also a storyline. And you can start to question that also from the thought structures. Mostly we describe ourselves using adjectives such as introvert or persisting or authentic or respectful. But those adjectives are not helpful at all. Psychologists have already found out, end of the 70s, that it completely, most of the personality models are oversimplifications of attributions that we use. But it becomes interesting when you start to examine the attributions you attribute to yourself and to the other, and what effect that has. A personality is something that is socially co-constructed and co-created. And so you, the thought structures enable you to build a very, very, very rich perspective, going beyond insights MBTI, Enneagram, and other oversimplifications of personality.
Thank you.
So the comment there, the map is not a territory. Well, you know, the thought structures help you to explore the territory from a phenomenological perspective.
Jan, I want to build on that. So one of the things that I really taking from this conversation is the fact that we are all working with a model of reality. And the challenge is that more often than not, that model, well, first of all, that model is not complete. The map is never as detailed as the territory. And there's always gaps. There's things that can be explored and filtered in. But the challenge from a requisite agility point of view is developing the most robust mapping we can so that we can truly make sense of what's going on in the context, in the situation, so that we can facilitate the transformation that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. In your experience, I mean, how have you seen the limitations of not understanding the territory has actually contributed to failure?
Well, if persons do not, as a consultant, using the meta perspective and the meta thinking, you see what the limits are in a team. And you cannot propose solutions that go beyond the comprehension of the team at that moment. Often what I do is that in the change trajectory, I always include space to invite colleagues, bringing in a kind of an inspirational content session, what the team misses. And if I'm doing that, I choose the person with the broadest perspective present in the team, and I try to broaden his or her thinking process, giving that person a more crucial role in a kind of a co-creational team I work with. So in all the change processes, I work with a co-creational team, and that co-creational team is accountable for the quality of the thought processes during the transition period. And so if you label a if you are tasking that co-creational team as being accountable for the quality of the thought processes developed, then you create the enabling environment for learning on that aspect. And it is that team that will look into the organization for people who are missing it, who could bring in a missing perspective. Often in IT, for example, IT architects often have a very, very broad perspective, but by nature have a more engineering background. And if I may, you allow me to make an overgeneralization, they're often introverts. And so they are not spotted in their potential. But then we include them in the co-creational team, and you kind of start to form the richest possible shadow management team. Yeah, and that's how I start influencing the governance structure, the processes and the systems within the organization, and influence what combinations of projects will be made or not made.
So so effectively, by introducing the thought forms, we banter these words around complex adaptive system. Essentially, it's allowing the system to adapt, the individuals participating to adapt, because their thinking is being enriched. They're seeing new things. They're able to explore new ways of approaching the problem that they're trying to solve. And you're simply creating a catalyst to facilitate the change.
Yes, that's correct.
Let me build on something else though that I think is really important, because obviously in an agile world, there's so much focus on teams, and you have written a lot about self-organization, self-organizing teams. And one thing that I call out, from a adult development point of view, a lot of what we're talking about is growing into systems thinking. A lot of the thought forms are touching on different aspects of systems thinking and understanding the parts to the whole and so forth. But that is actually the first stage of post-formal development in a lot of ways. Going beyond what was originally projected by Piaget. And when we start looking at teams, then a team is not just a team. A team is composed of people who are at different developmental stages, different developmental maturity in their thinking and in their social emotional development, as you've shared. How do you take into account, if I'm a scrum master, if I'm a person who is wanting to see the team move into new directions, how do you take into account the developmental stages of different people to be able to help that team grow in a positive direction and not move downward like you indicated some teams will go because of the pull of the different player?
My first answer is objectify it. Start to measure developmental phase and stage. And at this moment, we are moving into the 6th generation of tools to objectify it. I personally developed a software based on semantic intelligence, which means software and algorithms that probe for the sense and the meaning behind the concept. So if people, for example, find respect important, what do they mean by that? And the software is able to probe for more than 1,000 different interpretations of every concept that you can imagine to use. And so the software is developed, that's the dynamic collaboration software, of looking at roles from an accountability for sub-processes, not activities, and finding out the corresponding fluidity of thinking and maturity level. And if you people quickly enter the thinking on their role and where do they make a difference. And the moment that they get it, that their contribution needs constant updates, because that's also a challenge. There are no tools in companies to update roles. Even the role of a Scrum Master, for example, is awfully out of date at this moment, as you find it on most websites. And most companies and most human resources systems lack the ability to quickly update in co-creation and see when you change one role, how will it change another role in the interrelationship. Well, that's what my software does. And at the same time, it shows in whatever constellation, if you build project teams, or if I would, for example, put together the people on my screen at this moment, and I have the maturity and the fluidity of thinking of this team, 25 people, then I can predict whether this team will narrow or broaden the challenge or just act in line of the challenge. And that's basically an assessment process that goes very quickly because the semantic software immediately adapts to the complexity of the thinking that you have. Mm. So it creates in real time the questions that are only relevant for you. So everybody using the software will receive different questions because the past experience, the fluidity of thinking, the social emotional maturity level is different from each of us. So we needed to solve the question, how can a system generate questions that are only relevant for the person who is filling in? And that enabled us to objectify it in about 35 minutes on average.
Awesome. And that ultimately, I mean, I think it's important to recognize, and I'm hearing you saying this, that since everyone is at a different stage, different level of maturity, socially, emotionally, developmentally, that serves a purpose in an organization, because a particular task requires a certain level of social emotional maturity to be able to address it.
Yes.
And as an individual and at a group level. So how have you found executives to take to the concept of developing their teams, developing the maturity, the emotional maturity, the cognitive maturity within the team? How have you found that to be addressed by executives as they've come to understand these concepts?
Well, by being very cautious when introducing it. Research shows that none of us function from one level of maturity. You have a kind of a gravity point and a zone of regression and a zone of risk and a zone of potential. The zone of potential is what I call the zone of proximal development. Instead of maturity, I talk about what are the motivational patterns that function as scripts and that determine how people fulfill their role. Are they, for example, able to make the difference between being an expert or fulfilling the role as experts, which is a huge difference social emotionally. Well, in order to move from being an expert to fulfilling the role, if you fulfill the role, it's much easier to combine it with other roles to fulfill. But if you are the expert, every critique on that expertise is taken as a personal critique, and that doesn't help very much. So you need to address it from the point of view of what recognize managers and help them to work with what they already recognize. So you cannot work with theoretical concepts like maturity. You do that under professionals like we are here together. But if you engage with managers, well, start with issues that they experience. And they experience that somebody is, for example, not open enough, or holds on information, or handles in a suboptimal way conflicts, or is not anticipating enough. And so you need to translate those behavioral concepts in social emotional concepts. In my last book, Practices of Dynamic Collaboration, I offer plenty of examples of how you can do that.
Awesome.
Yeah, but it's always helping them seeing the proximal zone of development. It doesn't make sense to help somebody think transformational if that person has yet to discover contextual thinking. Then the transformational thought structures are way out of reach for that person. You see?
Yes, yes. Well, Jan, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think we've tapped on a lot of topics that we really could dig in deeper. We've 90 minutes have flown by. I want to bring the session to a close, but we will continue to open conversation with any other questions that may be available. I do want to remind everyone, if I'm going to share my screen very quickly, we have our session for tomorrow. And Pierre Nice will be continuing the conversation with his session tomorrow on From Whale to Swarm. So exploring how formation of agile organizations. And so again, 11 a.m. Eastern time on the 26th, we will continue that conversation. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone for their participation today. And again, the conversation is not over. We're just kind of beginning in some regards, but feel free to just continue open discussion at this point for another 20, 30 minutes or so.